Hi, welcome back, guys. So let's talk about Angular interview questions today. These are some of the most commonly asked Angular interview questions to a junior level or a mid-level front-end Angular developer that I have listed for you in these slides, and I'm going to discuss them in detail. And of course, while discussing these questions, I will kind of try to explain a little bit more so that the topics, some other topics are also covered that are maybe not mentioned in these questions, right? So let's start. This is the outline. Normally I'm going to go over these slides and talk about these topics, and then we will discuss some other topics that come in detail inside these topics, right? So what is AngularJS? What is Angular? Of course, there is a difference between Angular and AngularJS. We will discuss that. What are directives in Angular? Then node package manager will be discussed. Types of directives in Angular. There are two different types of directives in Angular. We'll discuss that, structure or behavior, and what are they. We will talk about them. What is Angular CLI? Different features of Angular. Typescript. What is Typescript actually? Decorators in Angular. Data binding. Of course, there's two-way data binding in Angular as well. What are templates in Angular? And the difference between components and modules in Angular. Yeah, so let's go ahead. So what is Angular? Angular is actually an open source web or mobile application framework, you can say. It is TypeScript based, open source web framework. TypeScript is, of course, a language similar to JavaScript. It is the difference is that it is typed. JavaScript is not typed strongly. And next is that Angular was created by Google actually, and then it is supported by a community of individuals, developers, and corporation. And then that's how it is developed. The different versions of Angular are coming, and different things and different libraries and different packages and everything is being added. So what does Angular framework actually do? It combines these views, these CSS, HTML view elements, with this model, JavaScript model. So here in between is sitting the Angular framework. So it's kind of a MVVM or MVC, a model view control or a model view model type. So we often call it also model view whatever because of that. So that's what Angular is. This is a very good, nice, simple block diagram of Angular framework. It's binding these UI elements, these view elements, CSS and HTML, to this JavaScript model. That's what Angular is doing actually. So next is this node package manager. What is NPM? As I said, NPM stands for Node Package Manager. It has a command line interface as well, so there are certain commands available. Using these commands, you can install different packages or different, from this online database or libraries, whatever you call it, and to perform different tasks in your Angular framework. Just like for any other programming language, you use NPM here to install different packages. These packages can do many things for you. For example, you can have a package to translate the languages or localization. You can have packages, for example, to do many things. For example, I don't know, whatever. You can have all possible kind of tasks that can be that are done in different kind of packages, and you install them, and then using those packages you import them, and then you have certain functionality available, and then just like any other programming language. That's what Node Package Manager is doing in Angular framework. And then another very important task of Node Package Manager is that it runs this JavaScript outside the browser. We know that JavaScript is running in this Google Chrome browser, for example, because there is a V8 engine behind that is responsible for running this JavaScript code on the front end of the Google Chrome. So Node Package Manager contains inside it this V8 engine that is responsible for running the JavaScript. Yeah, so now let's move on to the next slide. Number 5, difference between AngularJS and Angular. So Angular is actually TypeScript based, while AngularJS, which is the older version, it is JavaScript based. So older Angular is normally also called as the AngularJS. The older Angular means the versions 1.2 to 1.5, etc. While the new Angular, which is above the version 2, the Angular 2 or Angular 4, they are called Angular, just simply Angular, because they are not JS or JavaScript based. So that's the difference. The new Angular is not JavaScript based, but it is TypeScript based. That's why it is called Angular. The old Angular is JavaScript based. That's why it is called AngularJS, or of course JavaScript based Angular or AngularJS. So that's it. Apart from that, there is also another difference between AngularJS and Angular, and that is how the architecture is of both of these frameworks. The new Angular, which is this TypeScript-based Angular, that is normal Angular, is actually a component-based architecture, and the older Angular is a controller-based, that is this model view controller-based architecture. This is one big app. There are no individual components like in the new Angular. That's also one of the basic differences. I can show you what is model view controller. This AngularJS architecture. It is like something like this. You have a user here. The user is sending a request here to the controller. The controller is then communicating with the model to kind of process this this request from the user. And when the controller wants to give a response back to the user, he is going to then send this, of course the business process is done here in the controller. It's going to send the response again using this model. This is two-way between controller and view to this controller and model. This is two-way communication. So when the controller wants to send a request back to the user, it's going to simply send the request back through here. This from the view. The user will see the response of the request that is sent on the view. So that's how it is done. This is MVC. M, V, and C, model view controller based architecture. The user sends a request to the controller. Kind of joins, communicates with the model and tries to kind of process this request, and then it sends this request back to the view, to the response back to the view, and then review then send the response to the user. This is what is called a model view controller based architecture, this AngularJS based architecture. And so what is this new Angular now? It's the same thing, just the only difference is that in the new Angular you have kind of different, for example, if you have a web page, so you will divide this web page into, for example, a header, this is a footer, and then this is the sidebar, and then this is the main. So for example, if we want to write, kind of design the header, so we can have for this header, for example, we will have a view, for example, HTML, CSS, we will have a controller for this header, and we will have a model for this header. So this header can be a standalone, kind of a web page which has all the input, outputs, everything necessary. It can, work as an independent business unit, you can say, or an independent functionality. It can work, not depending on this sidebar or on this main page, or on this footer. So of course individually they have the same structure of implementation, like there is a view, there is a model, and there is a controller, but this is more component based, this new JavaScript, this new Angular, so this is Angular, this component based architecture. And this thing that I explained you, this is model view controller, which is AngularJS. So that's the difference between the two. Now let's go back. So what else? Of course, the new Angular also has a mobile compliant CLI, so you can also run on the mobile application. and this new Angular, which is Angular only, which is also allows lazy loading and it's SEO friendly. So now we move on to our next slide. So what is the next slide? What are the different directives in Angular? You know, directives have actually two types. I will explain you the types in the next slide. But what are directives in Angular? Directives are actually syntaxes. These are Angular syntaxes that we used in these HTML pages. And for example, they will be like some you know, kind of you know, this, as if we have for and if statement in normal Java language, you know. So we will have for example, ng if is a directive, ng for is a directive, ng container is a directive, ng model is a directive, you know, ng repeat, ng class is a directive. You know, you see, if for example this data is available, then show this part of the HTML. You know, we use ng if we want to use, for example, one HTML component, we want to show it more than once, you know, so we can use ng for. You know, in the same way we can use ng container, you know, if there is, you know, we can, based on these directives, we can modify the appearance or the behavior of our HTML DOM, you know, just like in normal Java or some other programming language. Based on if and for and these conditions, we can modify the behavior of our code. In the same way, we can modify the behavior of our view, HTML view or DOM. We can modify the behavior or appearance of this view based on these directives, you know, these directives in Angular. So now, different types of directives. There are two types of directives: structural directives and this is structural and attribute directives. So as the name suggests, the difference is very simple. Structural directive means if a directive is adding or removing an element in your HTML layout, you know, then it is changing the structure of your layout, of course, because it's adding or removing some element, you know. So anything, it can be any button, it can be any text, it can be any whatever, you know, possible thing in HTML, any element of HTML. If it adds or removed any element based on this directive, then it is called a structural directive. But if this ng directive or Angular directive only changes the style or appearance of an element or component, then it's called an attribute directive. Okay? For example, a structural directive is ng if or ng for. As I said, if you use ng if, for example, you can say that, okay, if this is true, then show this element in the HTML layout, or ng for, you know, show this element this number of times in an HTML layout, you know. The other kind of directive that is changing only the style or the appearance or appearance or behavior of the element, the attribute directive. Its example is, for example, ng class or ng style. You know, I haven't mentioned it here, ng style, but you can also mention ng style here. So these are actually directives or different types of directives. So we have covered these two slides now. Now let's go to the next slide. So what is Angular CLI? So Angular CLI is actually a ready-made kind of a project template. Let's say you can use some Angular CLI command and it will generate some basic project structure for you, or, you know, a kind of a template that has all the minimum things to make it run, of course. And you can also use some Angular CLI command like ngserve, etc., to kind of deploy or test your project, and then install it. It is installed using of course the Node package manager as well. And as you see, I wrote that it creates a TS file, HTML file, or STS file. You know, if you kind of create a project template, then these files, you know, .ts file on HTML file for view, TS file for controller, you know, all these files will be generated. And it increases, of course, the speed of our coding because all the basic things are already defined in those created files. And if you go to the web and you write Angular CLI here, you can see if you say npm install -g Angular CLI, it will install Angular CLI in the global scope. And then you can say ng new, this is new, my dream app. So it will create, you know, So it will create an application that already works right away, with this command, with the project. Then ngGenerate you can use to this command to create components, routes, services, whatever you want, pipes. Normally I use it to create components, and then it generates this TS file, HTML file, and this s.scs file, etc. as well. And then ngserve, which easily tests your app locally while developing. So this is a very important node package from Angular, this Angular CLI. So it will make your coding very efficient and fast. So that's all about Angular CLI. Now we can go to the next slide. So what are the different features of Angular? So Angular is cross-platform. So we can build kind of progressive web applications with the Angular framework. What do you mean by progressive web applications? You can ask that the interviewer. So progressive web application means any web application, any normal web application that you use using the normal web application technologies like HTML, CSS, whatever, and that can be deployed across different platforms, even mobile platforms that use any ordinary browser. So you can open this application on your mobile app, on your mobile phone, using any normal browser, Google Chrome or Microsoft MS Explorer, whatever you have on your mobile. So you can use this browser on your mobile and also open the the web app on your mobile, and it will look very nice, adaptive to your mobile screen. This is called a progressive web application. And then the other feature of Angular is that it uses dependency injection, and then it uses Typescript as a language. Typescript, as we know, it's a typed version of JavaScript. And then speed, it has a very high speed and performance. It uses model view controller architecture. This old Angular, and of course the new Angular also uses this component based, where each component, like header and sidebar and footer, or on the main page, you have different components, and all these components can function as a separate independent entity, using this model view controller architecture. So it uses MVC architecture. It has an efficient two-way data binding. The code is very less in this framework, so very less code framework, and of course it uses this Angular CLI, and then we have these Angular directives like if ng-for, and ng-style, ng-class. What is Angular CLI? We already discussed it. Using Angular CLI, you can generate, for example, a layout of your project. Let's say you say new project, and you will get some basic UI elements. You will get some .ts file, some framework, some what you can say some template of your project. You can, or your component, you can generate using Angular CLI. Of course, you can also test it using ngserve command. This is also part of Angular CLI. And then we have this Angular materials. Angular materials, you have some icons and all those different kind of controls available to use on the front end UI. So these are all different features of Angular. So Angular is very rich in features. So let's go ahead. What is TypeScript? TypeScript is actually it is similar to JavaScript. It's very similar to JavaScript. It's kind of a superset of JavaScript, and you can, if you add types, strong types to JavaScript, then you will get TypeScript. So what do we mean by adding types? Like, for example, whenever we declare a variable, we have to tell which type it is, string, number, whatever, and then we can catch errors even during coding, or compiling, whatever, and so the program execution becomes faster. And TypeScript is also open source, and TypeScript runs on all of those browsers, or wherever JavaScript is running. So it's also based on that V8 engine. This runtime engine is V8, so Node, it can also run without any browser using Node package manager, as we discussed before. Just like Node package manager runs JavaScript, it can also run TypeScript. So this is the difference between TypeScript and JavaScript. So what are decorators in Angular? Decorators are actually, you know, some functions that are adding metadata to your class or members of your class. You know, you must have seen them in Angular a lot. Like, for example, they are prefixed with this @ of symbol. So @ of component, for example, you define in the and then in the inside this decorator you define, sorry, you have, for example, an HTML file, a TS file, and, you know, a CSS file. And similarly we have ng module, @ of input, @ of directive. You know, these different kind of directives that we use, sorry, decorators, these different kind of decorators that we used in Angular. So yeah, so the definition of a decorator is that they are the functions that allow a service or a directive or a filter to be modified prior to its usage. You know, modifying means adding some metadata. And you can use decorators with a component, as I said, using this @ of component, with a module like @ of ng module, with a field, for example, using @ of input or @ of output. You can use decorators with a directive, so you can use @ of directive. You know, you can use, when you are using dependency injection, you can just write @ of injectable, you know, in your class, and then you can use dependency injection, or @ of pipe before a filter. So these are different kinds, different decorators in Angular, you know, and that's what decorators are. So let's go to the next question. What are different types of decorators in Angular? So there are two types of decorators in Angular: class decorators and class field decorators. So class decorators are these, for example, @ of component, @ of ng module, @ of directive, @ of injectable, @ of pipe. They are the class level decorators. Then we have these field level decorators, which are @ of input and @ of output. So you use this @ of input decorator if you want to receive data from a parent component to a child component. Then you use @ of input decorator. But you use @ of output decorator if you want to send data from a child to a parent component. Yeah, so to send data from child to parent, you use @ of output. To receive data from parent to the child, you write @ of input decorator. Similarly, for these class level decorators, you use, if you want to define a component, you use @ of component decorator. If you want to define a module, you use @ of ng module decorator. If you want to define a directive, you use @ of directive decorator. If you want to use dependency injection in your class, you use @ of injectable decorator. If you want to define a pipe, you use @ of pipe decorator. So that is a bit of explanation of decorators in Angular. So you can see here in this example, we have defined here there is a decorator component which is defining this component here, and you know, its template, its selector, and styles and everything. And then we have these fields. You know, for example, this name string, this name field is going to be an input. For example, it is going to get the data from its parent component, and this is the output. It's gonna send data to its parent component, you know. So this is the output value of or output field, and this is the input field. So that's how we write decorators inside Angular. So what is data binding in Angular? Well, data binding means the transfer of data, the communication of data between a view and a controller in any component in Angular. So whenever a data flows from review with this HTML file in our Angular framework and the TS file, this is called data binding. And there are two types of data bindings, one-way data binding and two-way data binding. Two-way data binding, of course, means when the data is going from the view to the controller and also for the controller to the view, in both directions, from the TS file to the HTML file and from HTML to TS. So this is, if this is happening both ways, it is called two-way data binding. But if it's happening only one way, let's say from HTML to TS or from the TS file or the controller to the HTML. So if in any one direction, the flow of data is in any one direction, it's called one-way data binding. And there are three types of one-way data bindings. One is this event binding, the next is the interpolation, and the third is property binding. So these three, this one, and this one, property, interpolation, and event binding, they are the examples of one-way data binding. And then two-way data binding I already explained. So what is the difference between these three: property, interpolation, and event binding? Event binding is of course easy. For example, you have a button on your HTML file, and let's say this button has some, if some change name event takes place, then this function do something will be called, which is defined in our component. Let's say do something, so this function will be called, and that's how. So the event is going from the view to the component. So this is called event binding. And then we have this property binding thing. I searched for an example on Google, this Telerik.com website. You see here you have a property of a button, let's say in your HTML file, which is disabled property. It should be true or false, and we are passing this property from the TS file, from the component. We are setting it to disable or enable here, and it just goes here in the property, and the button will be shown, or button will be shown as enabled or not enabled, depending on if the button disabled is true or false. So this is property binding and event binding, both explained. Now interpolation. Interpolation is simply, you have some property of your component, let's say any property with some name. It can be, let's say, some information that you want to show in your HTML. Let's say it's a number. It's the number of cycles, name of an employee, name of some visitor, or things like this, or number of days or anything, and then you want to show that on HTML, and you pass from the TS file. Then you can call this using these two curly open braces and curly close braces. You simply put this name, property name, inside it with the same name as you declared in your TS file, and then this will be shown. These braces will convert it to a string and then show on your HTML or on your view. So this is called interpolation, and this is also one way. This is from the controller to the view. So property binding and interpolation is direction is from controller to the view, and the event binding is the direction is from view to the controller, and then this two-way binding is a binding which is both ways. Okay, as an example for two-way data binding, we can use, for example, ng model. Let's say we have some input component on our HTML, and we write something into it, and then we pass it back to our TS file using ng model, and then our TS file then sends it back, and let's say prints it in another HTML component. So in this way you are inputting data from the HTML. The data is going back to the TS file, and then it's coming back to the HTML file and being displayed in some other component, or other what should I say, and displayed in some other component of our view, so of the HTML layout. So So the data is going from the HTML layout to the TS and then coming back to the HTML layout. So this is called some kind of a two-way. This is, as an example, a two-way data binding. I can explain you here with a picture. Let's say this is our HTML file, this outer black rectangle, and then we have here an input. Let's say we put here a name, and then we have a text file, let's say a text here to display this name here, you know, at the same time. So we are going to kind of you know, pass this data to our controller. This will be the controller. So data is going to come from the view to the controller, and then this is, you know, for example, you can use ng model for this, you know. Ng model is a good example, and then this data is going back from the controller to the view and is being displayed here. So in this text field, you know, and let's say this was an input field, you know, input, where you can simply input something, and then maybe you can click a button here, and then this button sends it back to this thing that you input to the controller, and then the controller sends it to displays it in the text field on the view. So this is how two-way data binding works. So I hope you understand now what I meant using ng model to do a two-way data binding. So what are the templates in Angular? Templates are actually these our view elements, these HTML views, which have this HTML syntax, have CSS classes for styling, and Angular directives, etc., are also used in such views. A component in Angular, you know, has a reference to this template. You use this at the rate of component decorator, and inside this component decorator you define your you know, HTML view using a path, you know, define the path to this view. I can show you this in StackBits using an example. You see, this is the component decorator, and inside this decorator you define your template URL. You know, you set this path. So this app component.html is your template that is actually kind of referenced here inside the component decorator. So that's a bit about templates. So what's the difference between modules and components in Angular? Well, a component, we all know, is kind of a stand-alone, what you can say, a functionality which has an HTML file, a TS file, or logic in the TS code, and then some service that can be attached to it. So this is what a component is in Angular. So you can like, a component can work independently, like as a standalone entity inside Angular. Let me show you how, you know, in a bigger HTML project and a component will look like. Let's say we have this view. This is our whole HTML view. Inside this view we will have let's say a header component, you know. So this is our header component, let's say, and then let's say this is our sidebar, this is our footer component, and this is our main body. So these are different components, you know, and you can combine all these components to create kind of one functionality, like one bigger kind of a, you can say, project. You can combine them in certain way, and then like to create some kind of a common, you know, what you common application, and and that is then maybe called, that can be called a module, you can say. This whole can also be called a module, because it's a collection of different components. Yeah, but a component is reusable. You can reuse this in some other, let's say, module. You can use the same main page here, but let's say you can maybe change the input outputs, and then it can do something else, this component here. So it's more reusable thing, but module is not a reusable kind of entity. It's like a placement of different components in certain way to kind of achieve a different combined what you can say activity, or different combined functionality. So this is the relation between modules and components. So different components combine to create a module to achieve a certain functionality, and these components can be used in other modules, but these modules are not reusable, but the components are reusable. So this is kind of more or less the explanation of the difference between modules and components. It's quite easy to understand that in this perspective.